So this is going to be the third and final part of the Lord of the Rings personality typing series. So in the first episode of this series we looked at the Hobbits, and in the second episode we looked at the Fellowship of the Ring. Well, in this episode we're going to be taking pretty much all of the remaining characters and typing them in one fell swoop. So first up I want to type some elves, starting with Arwen. Like many others, I feel that Arwen did not get sufficient screen time in the films, but the scenes that we did get, we saw quite a well-balanced individual. When first introduced to her, she has that immediate kind of compassion, but she also has this kind of decisiveness too. She's not afraid to shoot Aragorn down when he suggests that she stays and looks after the hobbits. In fact, she points out she is the faster rider. She seems very concrete in her identity, and we explore throughout the films that she's extremely in touch with what is valuable to her, what is meaningful to her, even to the point of being arguably stubborn. But this first scene really demonstrates her decision-making prowess, and looking at her introverted feeling, extroverted thinking axis, it's clear there's a fair degree of fluidity here. But in terms of the lenses, it's apparent that she has introverted sensing connected to introverted feeling. And when she starts to carry Frodo on horseback to Rivendell to get him the healing that he needs, and is subsequently chased by the Nazgul, it becomes all too apparent her extroverted intuitive lens connected to her extroverted thinking function. She's incredibly strategic, forward-focusing, improvising upon an extroverted intuitive atmosphere, all the while being highly aware of the extroverted intuitive contingency. But in terms of choosing between ESTJ, INFP, ENFP, and ISTJ, the constants here seem like introverted feeling and extroverted intuition. These functions do not seem in any way, shape or form optional for this character. And like many elves, she is an extremely individuated individual, having lived many lifetimes. But it seems to me her default state is as an introverted feeling dominant more than it is a much more forward-moving, extroverted intuitive dominant. And it is so clear how much she reflects upon, how much her primary dialogue is intrinsically connected to her bond with her love Aragorn. And so I'm going to type Arwen as an INFP, because as fluid as our axis is between introverted feeling and extroverted thinking, everything is engaged through the limbic doorway. And now let's take her father, Elrond. In many ways he fits with ESFJ, doesn't he? He's fairly traditional, he's quite conservative, all the while macro-managing a social atmosphere. And as shown in the prologue of the film, is very comfortable in a leadership position. However, I'd actually say Elrond is an ENFJ. And I definitely agree, the lead extroverted feeling is apparent. The hyper-divergent, hyper-reliable introverted thinking is also apparent. But in terms of the lenses themselves, I don't actually believe Elrond's authority function, his divergent auxiliary, is introverted sensing. Because yes, as a person with great responsibility, he is in many ways quite conservative and quite hyper-rational. But it is important to bear in mind Elrond has lived many lifetimes. And not only that, he has pretty much the weight of Middle-earth on his shoulders. But despite all of this responsibility, all of this weight that he's carrying, and as pragmatic he may have been in his conversation with Gandalf in the Fellowship of the Ring, I actually think Elrond's authority function is introverted intuition. Because like Gandalf the Grey, and indeed Aragorn, Elrond has a vision. It is not always as conscious and under convergent control as those two characters, but he is still very much forward-focused. He still has his kind of innate optimism. And it only took a nudge from his daughter Arwen to take a leap of faith, allow his daughter Arwen to remain on Middle-earth, despite the fact that all hope seemed to be lost. And furthermore, he's not exactly macro-managing an extroverted feeling atmosphere like an ESFJ would be. I mean, comparing him to Boromir. Yes, Boromir is many times younger than he is. But it is quite clear that Elrond much prefers a one-on-one social situation. When it came to the Council of Elrond, he dipped into extroverted thinking in order to address a group much as an ENFJ would. But when it came to the social nuances, he very much abstained from impacting the social macroscopic atmosphere until it was emotionally neutral. Because the ENFJ is much more comfortable engaging their extroverted feeling through extroverted sensing, and that's a much more narrow scope. And it is quite apparent that Elrond's extroverted feeling comes alive when engaged on a one-on-one situation. And now let's take Galadriel. I mean, I can sort of get how dichotomy-wise she can seem like an INFJ. She's definitely much more of a feeler than she is a thinker, but I don't particularly like the dichotomies anyway. Because in so many ways it is the INTJ who is a true INFJ. Because it is this type who has feeling as the convergent auxiliary to their intuition. And yeah, I do think Galadriel is an introverted intuitive dominant. She's so concerned with the abstract. She's so constantly engaged with internalized contingency. But her abstractions, her internal dialogue is not cerebral in nature, it is much more limbic. It is much more symbolic, metaphorical, experiential. She is deeply, deeply relational, and she does so in an internalized manner more than an externalized one. And if this already doesn't imply introverted feeling, just look at her transformation when Frodo offers her the ring. She tries to place herself into an archetype. She pushes her self-transformative, introverted, intuitive, introverted feeling capability to the max in order to see what her future is, in order to mold her identity in that moment. And this scene between her and Frodo is a perfect representation of the much more limbic abstractions of the INTJ, as opposed to the more cerebral ones of the INFJ. She takes on an identity and casts it into the future in order to see whether it is truly congruent with not only her, but external logical reality. And again, Galadriel has lived for many, many centuries, and as such she is an extremely individuated character. She doesn't have an antagonistic relationship with an extroverted thinking authority function. She doesn't have this pull and tug between introverted intuition and extroverted sensing. She doesn't have an innate blindness to the extroverted feeling micro-expression in the world around her. But despite this, it is quite clear that she engages her relational capacity on a more introverted scale. And the last elf I want to address very briefly is Haldir. And I say very briefly because, again, it doesn't get a lot of screen time, it doesn't get a lot of dialogue. And of course, while I do not have a lot of information to go on, my general guesstimate for this character would be ISFJ. He seeks to honour the alliances of old, and seems very precise and meticulous. All the while he's very comfortable casting an extroverted feeling gaze over a broad landscape, being as he is a commander of armies, all the while having an authority function that compels a specific duty-bound altruistic agenda. And now let us address the Rohirrim, and I'm going to finally start giving the ESTJ some loving because I'm starting with Theoden. And I really cannot see another dominant stack for this character other than extroverted thinking with a convergent auxiliary of extroverted intuition. Just look how macroscopic his extroverted thinking cogitations are. Theoden is so hyper-aware of all the moving parts within his extroverted intuitive scope, and his sense of contingency is extrapolating upon the near present. Unlike many ESTJs, the extroverted feeling dipping of this character is not particularly strong. But on the other hand, we do catch him in the films in a particularly insecure place. He'd just been humiliated in front of his entire kingdom, and before he has time to recover from the trauma he endured as a thrall of Saruman, his entire kingdom is under threat, and he has to make an immediate executive decision. And thankfully for him, he has a cognition perfectly suited to making such sudden executive calls. Theoden is not a slow decision maker, he is not ponderous. He is not internalizing a contingency in his brain to see where things are going to be in 10 years. He is occupied with the near future, and this is extroverted thinking and extroverted intuition. And while many ESTJs are actually quite forward-thinking, to the extent as many of them mistyping as INTJs, Theoden, on the other hand, neatly fits the typical ESTJ archetype because he's constantly outside of his immediate extroverted intuitive contingency, defaulting back to previous experiences. I've fought in many wars, Master Dwarf. I know how to defend my own people. Not to mention he's constantly comparing himself to his forefathers. He's constantly feeling inadequate in their mighty company. And indeed, one of the last things he says to Eowyn, he goes now to the halls of his forefathers, in whose mighty company he shall no longer feel ashamed. Because as strong as his introverted sensing, introverted feeling identity is, and as much as a unchanging, unmoving sentinel that he might be, he still compares his actions constantly to the deeds of his ancestors, and finds himself unworthy. And even after winning the siege of Helm's Deep, saving his people, in every way proving himself the king that people know him to be, he beats himself up. He says again to Eowyn, it was not Theoden of Rohan that led our people to victory. Theoden is actually one of my favourite characters. I think he's incredibly, incredibly strong. When all of the odds are against him, he rises up, and time again leads his people to victory. He plays such an instrumental part in the defeat of Mordor. And it is rather touching that at the end of the films, Theoden finally found himself worthy in his own eyes. He finally acknowledged his own deeds, his own heroism. And as bitter as he was about the notion of calling to Gondor for aid, as much as he believed throughout the entire Two Towers that Rohan stood alone, that nobody cared, he barely hesitated to go to Gondor's rescue when they called for aid, because his values are constant, and as cynical as he might be, as bitter as he might be, he still acts in accordance with what he believes to be right. And now let's take Eowyn. There were many parallels to be drawn between this character and Arwen. They're both highly individualistic. They're both highly in touch with a deeply held concrete identity that is in every way, shape and form intense and unmoving, and in many ways stubborn. All the while being able to fluidly interact with an extroverted, intuitive, extroverted thinking atmosphere, taking new situations in their stride, and effectively innovating their way to victory. However, as deeply in touch as Eowyn is with her introverted sensing, introverted feeling landscape, I do believe her primary domain is the external. How many times are there in the film when she is not reacting against the external world? How many times are there in the films when she is not a person of action, leaving her mark upon the external atmosphere in accordance with her concrete and unyielding identity? To me, Eowyn screams ENFP. And just look how convergent her extroverted intuition is. She takes entirely new situations in her stride. And much of these decisions come from an introverted feeling of authority. She acts in accordance with what she believes to be right. She time and time again asserts her autonomy and independence. In keeping with an introverted feeling of authority, she is utterly defiant of those who would go against her values, all the while reacting against an extroverted intuitive atmosphere, in order to not only envision what she believes to be right, but to accomplish the goals that go alongside. She teaches herself to use a sword, not only joining the war, concealing her face with a helmet, but also taking Merry, who is also forbidden from joining the war, alongside her, because she is championing his cause. And her unyielding introverted feeling values apply not only to her own independence and autonomy, her own right to make her own decision, but to Merry as well. And I'd say Eowyn's probably the most socially progressive individual out of all of the characters. And I think one only needs to take a look at her prowess upon the Battle of the Pelennor Fields to see extroverted intuition and extroverted thinking in action. And finally, let's take Eomer. Eomer strikes me as an ESFJ with a heavy amount of extroverted thinking dip from the dominant position. And of course, owing to the situation he is in at the beginning of the Two Towers, having been banished from the kingdom of Rohan for doing naught but upholding the kingdom's laws and values in the first place, it's understandable why he is heavily cynical and almost completely resenting his extroverted feeling dominant function that got him into that position in the first place. Because aside from the Rohirrim who have joined him, he has completely lost trust in humanity. But of course, as soon as he receives word that Theoden has regained his sanity, he does not hesitate to come back and save his kingdom. Because his loyalty is not only to his king, but also to Rohan as a whole. And this is when we do begin to see a lot more extroverted feeling, extroverted intuitive application from this character. Because yes, he was already leading a large cohort, but in the post-Helm's Deep party, he's pouring the drinks. And we begin to see a much more jovial and group-oriented extroverted feeling application from the character. All the while his oppositional introverted thinking, connected as it is to his introverted sensing authority function, makes this type not only extremely traditional and loyal to a fault, but also forms a very concrete, pragmatic and reliable rational agenda that sets the agenda for his altogether more communal dominant stack. And it is through this particular character's heavy employment of extroverted thinking that he is in every way, shape and form a natural born leader. And now let's go to Gondor, starting with Faramir. Faramir strikes me as an introverted feeling dominant. He's incredibly gentle, altruistic, and feels extremely insecure that he cannot live up to the hyper-masculine expectations of his father, with much of Faramir's limbic energy being directed more internally, and with its feeling being much more convergent and adaptive. Faramir struggled to come out of the shadow of his elder brother. But honestly, Faramir never wanted to. Of course he wanted the love and affection of his father, but even at his tipping point at the very end of the Two Towers, he remained true to his values, he remained true to what he knew to be good and right. Because when we were first introduced to Faramir, he has been very much pushed to the edge. He's going all out in order to try and fulfill his role as a captain of Gondor, to really fit the archetype. And in every way, shape and form, he really does appear at the start of this film like an extroverted thinking dominant. But he keeps going back to this questioning internal limbic landscape. And this landscape is continuously informed by this kind of extroverted intuitive authority, uncertainty, this sense of, well, things could go 1,000 different ways. With it being continuously all too clear that Sam and Frodo, the hobbits that he had captured, that they were not the evil agents that he was trying to convince himself they were. So yeah, as a captain, as an INFP in an authority position, Faramir has a fairly fluid, dominant axis. He can play the role of an ESTJ. But he keeps coming back to this highly relational default state, relating as he is on an introverted feeling, introverted sense and concrete level, to the abstract contingencies of the external world. And as hard as he tried to become the person his father wanted him to be, he knew deep down that his father was the one who was corrupt. And throughout the course of the films, especially with help of Pippin, a fellow introverted feeling dominant, he begins to stand up for himself and forge his own path. So now let's take his father, Denethor. I mean, this isn't a particularly likeable character, is it? But then, this is a person who has lost his mind. He'd been using the Palantir and becoming corrupted by it for an unknown amount of time. And as noble as he may have been at the onset of his stewardship, eventually he'd been driven mad with power. And had even sent Boromir to claim the One Ring, to be used as yet another tool in his arsenal. But honestly, as power-hungry as he might be, his vision of the future and his sense of holistic contingency, particularly that more internal in nature, is almost completely and utterly suppressed. This is an individual completely grounded in the present, all the while being incredibly individualistic and self-transformative. His convergent agenda seems highly extroverted sensing, extroverted thinking, driven as it is by an introverted feeling or authority function. And in another time and place, perhaps this individuality, this strength of character, may have been a force for good, but as he was corrupted by Sauron via the Palantir, he became a mad, reactive, power-hungry, present-oriented individual, who issues commands entirely on the behest of whatever emotional flux he happens to be undergoing at any given moment. And yeah, Denethor is an example of an extremely corrupt ESFP. And even the most corrupt and unindividuated person of this type is still going to have a certain force of personality, a certain charisma. And it is this charisma alone that can get such people into, say, a high-ranking political position. And finally, let us look at the wizards. We've already typed Gandalf the Grey in episode 2 of this series, and I typed him as an INFJ. However, when he becomes Gandalf the White, he becomes, in every way, shape and form, a different person with the same memories and connections. And his cognition almost completely flips. He becomes an ENFJ. His thinking, once highly convergent and under active control, becomes highly divergent. Rather than creating his own logic, he begins to observe it. He becomes hyper-pragmatic. And that introverted intuitive vision, which was beforehand in Gandalf the Grey under constant management and control, becomes the authority function of this character. He is no longer assessing and recalculating his vision. He has a plan, and he's going with that plan, no matter what. He becomes much more uncompromising. He becomes much less philosophically and existentially inclined. Because this character has a job to do, and he's going to do this job. He's going to save Middle-earth at any cost. Rather, this character's energies are directed much more towards the external. He performs a much stronger leadership role. He constantly dips into extroverted thinking, alongside extroverted intuition, as an ENFJ often does when they're trying to lead a large cohort. Gandalf, in his transformation to Gandalf the White, turns from philosopher to general, no longer having the observational subtleties of the INFJ. Gandalf's charisma becomes a lot more overt. He issues instructions and he expects these instructions to be obeyed, with all the while his extroverted thinking cogitation stemming from an extroverted feeling dominant function. And now let's look at the wizard whose role he took over, Saruman. And much like Denethor, Saruman has been corrupted via the Palantir by Sauron. But unlike Denethor, I do believe there was a certain level of independent choice Saruman made in order to turn rogue. Because remember, this is a Maiar we are talking about here, and a particularly old one at that. No, Saruman's turning rogue was partially owing to corruption, sure, but it's also owing to simple pragmaticism. Because Saruman's perhaps one of the most hardly pragmatic individuals out of all of the characters. He sees and feels an extroverted intuitive contingency, alongside an extroverted thinking authority function, all the while feeling insecure in his own confidence as to what that contingency entails, all the while having this extroverted intuitive scope and introverted intuitive dip, very much optional and indeed suppressible, because Saruman's primary dialogue is introverted sensing and introverted feeling. He's incredibly traditional. He seeks to uphold the values in the status quo. He is there to keep the balance. That was his primary role, all the while being incredibly meticulous and reliable, and steadfast in his sentinel-like role. But it is also his hyper-individuality that made him comfortable taking that leap, because even though he was partially corrupted anyway, the sanity in him that likely remained saw the hopelessness of the situation, and being a convergent feeler, particularly of the convergent auxiliary position, began to incrementally mould his identity, his concrete identity, in order to accommodate the changing, extroverted thinking atmosphere. And let's not forget, this change itself would have been incredibly anxiety-inducing to this particular character, along with all of the uncertainty that went with it. Because Saruman's primary agenda is to secure certainty, and allying himself with Sauron was a much more certain outcome than taking a leap of faith like Gandalf the Grey did. So that concludes the Lord of the Rings series. I have typed a few more characters on my Patreon page, so definitely head on over to there if you're interested. If you enjoyed the video, be sure to let me know by hitting that like button below, and if you haven't already done so, be sure to hit that subscribe button down below with the bell icon next to it, because that way you can stay notified of future content. If you're interested in more of the underlying theory used in this video, I highly recommend you check out the CPT ebook. And if you yourself are uncertain about your type, I do offer a dedicated CPT type service, and more general consultations and type coaching too. So thank you again for watching, especially if you made it this far. You are awesome, and I'll be back in a few days' time. For now, take care of yourself.